23 stab wounds. It was not an execution. It was a ritual, a bloodbath in the marble heart of Rome. The man who believed himself a god. Gaius Julius Caesar lies bleeding at the feet of the statue of his greatest enemy, Pompey the Great. The irony is brutal. The assassins, senators, men who had dined with him the night before, raise their bloodied daggers. They do not flee, they shout. They called themselves the Liberators. They believed that on that day, the Ides of March of 44 before Christ, they had saved the Republic, that they had cut off the head of the serpent of tyranny. In their arrogance, they thought that the people of Rome would take to the streets to cheer them, to thank them for returning their freedom. But the people did not acclaim them. The silence in the forum was their first death sentence. A heavy silence, dense, charged with fear. Not fear of the dead tyrant, but of them, of the men who had unleashed chaos. Why did the people they claimed to have saved receive them with terror and not with flowers? Because the average Roman did not live in the senator's villas. He lived in harsh reality. And Caesar, the tyrant, had given them stability, victories, and bread. The liberators, on the other hand, only offered them an abstract idea of freedom and blood. The brain behind the plot, Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man consumed by personal resentment, and the face, the symbol, Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's adopted son, the man whose betrayal dealt him the mortal wound. It is said that Caesar's last words upon seeing his face were not of anger, but of painful surprise. "You too, my son." They believed they had won. They marched to the capital. They fortified themselves, waiting for the city to recognize them as the new fathers of the fatherland. They underestimated one man, a man who had not drawn a dagger, but whose words would be sharper than any steel. The consul Marcus Antony, and what is worse, they underestimated a ghost, a name. Hundreds of miles away in Apollonia, a sickly and unknown 18-year-old boy receives a letter. They inform him that his great-uncle Julius Caesar has been murdered. But that is not the news that will change the world. The real bomb is in the will. Caesar has adopted him as his son and main heir. That boy, ignored by everyone, will become the embodiment of revenge. He did not inherit only Caesar's fortune, he inherited his name. And with that name, a blood oath. His name was Gaius Octavius. His arrival in Rome would mark the beginning of the end for each of the 60 men who plunged their steel into the body of his adoptive father. They did not know it yet, but they had not killed a man. They had unleashed 2 monsters, civil war and Octavius. The hunt was about to begin and would not stop until the last of the liberators paid his debt with blood. For an instant, it seemed that blood would not call for more blood. In a desperate move to avoid civil war, the Senate granted amnesty to the chieftains assassins. A fragile pardon, tense, Brutus and Cassius came down from the Capitol, believing they had weathered the storm. They even dined with Marcus Antony in a truce as false as the smiles on their faces. They had control of the Senate. They had the daggers. They thought they had power. Their mistake was allowing Caesar a state funeral. Brutus was the first to speak. His speech was a work of stoic logic, cold, reasoned, philosophical. He appealed to virtue, to duty, to love for the Republic. He explained that he did not kill Caesar out of hatred, but out of love for Rome. Not that he loved Caesar less, but that he loved Rome more. The crowd, confused, nodded. They seemed to accept the terrible necessity of the act. The liberators breathed with relief. But then Marcus Antony climbed the rostra. He did not shout. He did not accuse. His voice was a whisper of pain that, however, reached every corner of the forum. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He said that Brutus was an honorable man, that they all were. He repeated the phrase again and again, "honorable men," and with each repetition, the word honorable rotted, becoming a poison, a sarcasm sharp as a razor. Then he bent down, lifted the toga that covered Caesar's body. The purple fabric, stiff with dried blood, revealed the 23 tears. "Look, here entered Cassius's dagger. See what breach envious Casca made. And through this other, beloved Brutus stabbed. He transformed a political assassination into personal butchery. He made the crowd see not a tyrant, but a betrayed man. And then the coup de grace, he took out a papyrus scroll, Julius Caesar's will." The crowd gasped when Antony read that Caesar bequeathed his private gardens to the people of Rome to convert them into public parks forever. And then the finishing touch. Caesar left to each Roman citizen, to each man in that square, a sum of 75 drachmas. Hell broke loose. Brutus's speech, so logical, faded before pure emotion. The people's love for their murdered benefactor exploded in a wave of uncontrollable violence. They tore the benches and tables from the forum to build an improvised funeral pyre for their hero right there. Then, with torches lit from that sacred fire, the mob became a pack of wolves. They no longer sought liberators, they sought murderers. Their first victim was an unfortunate poet called Gaius Helvius Cinna. They confused him with one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. His pleas did not matter. It did not matter that he shouted he was only a poet. They tore him limb from limb in the middle of the street. It was the first payment of the blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others saw the flames from their homes. They saw the people they claimed to have liberated march toward them with torches and knives. Their republican dream had become a nightmare. They had to flee Rome like thieves in the night. They were no longer senators, they were fugitives. And while they ran for their lives eastward, the real danger, young Octavius, disembarked in southern Italy. He did not bring an army. He brought something much more powerful, Caesar's name and a checkbook that would soon seem to have no bottom. And he was about to use both things to buy himself the loyalty of Rome's most lethal weapon, his father's legions. While Rome burned and the murderers fled, Octavius played his own game, a chess game on a board of razors. Upon arriving in Rome, he presented himself before Marcus Antony, the new master of the city. Antony saw him for what he was, a pale boy without experience, a simple annoyance. He refused to hand over Caesar's fortune using the money to consolidate his own power. It was a miscalculation that would cost him the world. They underestimated his name. Octavius began to sign as Caesar Octavianus, a stroke of genius for the people and the legions. He was Caesar. And when Antony denied him the money, Octavius did the unthinkable. He sold his own properties and those inherited from his family to pay the people the 75 drachmas that the will promised. He kept his father's word. Overnight, the boy became the favorite of the plebs and, more importantly, of the veterans of Caesar's legions. Men hardened in 1,000 battles who had adored the general. They saw in that young man the reincarnation of their leader. Octavius did not ask for their loyalty. He bought it with money, promises, and above all, with the power of an immortal name. He stole the legions from Antony right under his nose. The tension exploded. The two avengers of Caesar declared war on each other. But while they fought in northern Italy, alarming news reached them from the east. Brutus and Cassius were not wasting time. They had plundered the eastern provinces, accumulating a gigantic war treasure. They had recruited and formed 19 legions, a formidable army, financed by extortion and ready to march on Italy. Antony and Octavius realized a terrifying truth. They hated Caesar's assassins more than they hated each other. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony, Octavius, and a third man, Lepidus, Caesar's general. There, between mud and fog, these three men formed the second triumvirate. It was not an alliance. It was a pact of predators. They divided the world as if it were booty, and then to finance their war and eliminate their enemies at home, they unleashed terror. The prescriptions were not a simple list of enemies. It was a public death sentence. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equities wealthy class were declared enemies of the state. Their names, written on plaster tablets, were nailed in the forum. Anyone could kill them. It was not only permitted, there was a reward. The assassin received a part of the dead man's properties. The rest, for the triumvirate. Rome sank into bloody paranoia. Slaves murdered their masters to gain their freedom. Sons betrayed, fathers for the inheritance. No one was safe. And on that list, Antony demanded one name above all: Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator. Cicero was not one of the assassins, but his speeches against Antony had sentenced him. Octavius, who owed Cicero his political rise, agreed. He sacrificed him without blinking. Antony's assassins reached him near his villa. Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and offered his neck. They cut off his head and hands, the same hands that had written the speeches that so offended Antony. They took them to Rome, and in an act of supreme barbarity nailed them to the rostra, the platform from which Cicero had spoken so many times. The revenge was total. With Rome purged and its coffers filled with the blood of its enemies, the triumvirate turned its gaze eastward. The purge was over. Now the war began. Brutus and Cassius were not hiding. They had gathered in Greece with their 19 legions. The final confrontation that would decide the fate of the Republic was inevitable. The end of the Roman world had gathered on a plain in Greece called Philippi. It was not one army against another. It was one era against the next. On one side, Octavius and Antony, with Caesar's name as banner and revenge as fuel. On the other, Brutus and Cassius, with the dying idea of the Republic and the memory of a bloody dagger. More than 200,000 men, the largest concentration of Roman military power that history had ever seen, about to annihilate each other. The liberators' plan was astute. It was dictated by the cold logic of Cassius, an experienced general. His army was better supplied and controlled the sea. His strategy, wait, avoid a pitched battle, let hunger and disease wear down the triumvir's legions. But Brutus was not a strategist. He was a philosopher turned general. He was tormented. It was said that in his camp, the omens were terrible. 2 eagles that followed his legions were replaced by crows and vultures the day they arrived at Philippi. And legend tells that nights before the battle, a ghostly and terrible apparition appeared to him in his tent. "Who are you?" asked Brutus. The shadow replied, "I am your evil spirit, Brutus. We shall meet at Philippi." It was Caesar's ghost, or the ghost of his own guilt. Pressured by his impatient officers and haunted by his demons, Brutus imposed his will. They would force the battle. Cassius, against his judgment, gave in. The first battle of Philippi was chaos of blood and dust. On the right flank, Brutus's legions, with unstoppable fury, overwhelmed Octavius's, broke their lines, massacred his men, and plundered his camp. Octavius, sick, barely escaped with his life. From his perspective, it was a crushing victory. The Republic seemed to be reborn in a single and glorious assault, but at the same time, on the other flank, the story was radically opposite. Marcus Antony's veteran troops, more disciplined, shattered Cassius's legions. Antony's attack was brutal, implacable. Cassius's camp was taken, his men massacred, opposed in flight. Two simultaneous battles with two opposite results, and in the middle, the fog of war. Cassius had retreated to a hill to observe the battlefield. He saw in the distance that Brutus's camp was taken, but could not know that it was Brutus's own men celebrating and looting. Then he saw a cavalry detachment galloping toward him. They were Brutus's men coming to announce victory to him, but in the dust and distance, Cassius believed it was enemy cavalry. He believed that Brutus had been defeated. He believed that all was lost. The fog of war and a cloud of dust sentenced the man who had started it all. "Take it," he said to his freedman, handing him a dagger. "Free me from life." Pindarus obeyed. Cassius covered his face with his cloak and received the blow. He died at the hands of his own slave, using, according to legend, the same dagger with which he had stabbed Julius Caesar in the Senate. The final irony for a practical man, defeated not by the enemy, but by a tragic illusion. Shortly after, Brutus's messengers arrived at the hill shouting news of his victory. They found only the corpse of their commander. When Brutus arrived and saw the body of his friend and brother-in-law, his spirit broke. He called him through tears the last of the Romans. Cassius, the brain of the conspiracy, was dead, but Brutus, the soul of the movement, still lived. He commanded an army that was still formidable. For 3 weeks, the two sides observed each other, tension growing with each dawn. Brutus knew that time was running against him. His men were demoralized. Victory had turned to ash in his mouth. Pressured by his own troops and tormented by Caesar's ghost, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered a second and final attack. 3 weeks. 21 dawns in which the remains of the Republic's greatest army and the embodiment of Caesar's revenge observed each other across a valley soaked in blood. In Brutus's camp, morale had collapsed. Cassius's ghost and his useless death weighed on everyone. His legionaries, many of them mercenaries, began to desert. His officers pressured him, demanded a final battle before the entire army dissolved. Brutus, the philosopher, the idealist, no longer had control. He was trapped by the current of events that he himself had unleashed. The Second Battle of Philippi did not have the chaotic uncertainty of the first. It was a massacre. Brutus's legions charged with desperation, not with conviction. They faced the veteran troops of Antony and Octavian, hardened men, better commanded and fighting for victory, not to avoid defeat. The Republican lines bent, then broke. The retreat became an uncontrolled flight. The dream of the Republic did not die with a cry of defiance, but with the sound of thousands of men running to save their lives. Brutus managed to escape from the battlefield with a handful of his most loyal officers. They hid in the nearby hills, listening to the victory cries of their enemies and the sound of Antony's cavalry combing the area, searching for him. The man who had governed Rome for an instant now was a fugitive cornered in the darkness of a Greek forest. There, in the cold night, Brutus knew that everything had ended. He looked at his friends and pronounced the words that revealed the fracture of his soul. He lamented that the virtue for which he had sacrificed everything might be nothing more than an empty word, and that he had been a slave to fortune. The idealist crashed against the wall of reality. He had killed his friend and mentor for an idea, and that idea had just died before his eyes. He would not allow himself to be captured. The humiliation of being dragged through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumphal parade was a fate worse than death. He asked one of his officers, Clytus, to kill him. Clytus refused, weeping. He asked another. Dardanus also refused. Finally, he approached his friend Strato. He asked him to hold his sword with the point toward him. Strato, with tears in his eyes, obeyed. Brutus used his last strength to run and impale himself on the blade. He died instantly. The soul of the conspiracy had been extinguished. Shortly after, Antony's men found his body. Marcus Antony, in a gesture of unexpected nobility, removed his extremely expensive purple general's cloak and covered his enemy's corpse. Later, he would say that Brutus was the noblest of all Romans, the only one of the conspirators who acted for an ideal, not for envy. Octavian did not share that respect. When they brought him the news, his reaction was icy. He ordered that Brutus's head be cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar's statue. Octavian's revenge knew no nobility, only total annihilation. The contrast between the two victors at that moment sowed the seeds of the war that would come between them. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the heads of the conspiracy had been cut off. For the world, the civil war had ended. But Octavian did not think so. For him, revenge was not complete. Not until each of the 60 men who wielded a dagger that day was dead. The Great War had ended. Now began the silent hunt, a purge that would extend throughout all corners of the Mediterranean. For the remaining assassins, hell was just beginning. After the Battle of Philippi, the power of the Roman world remained in the hands of 3 men, and one of them, Octavian, had an obsession. The list of the 60 men who had participated in the murder of his father. Brutus and Cassius were only the first 2 important names to be crossed off. Dozens remained. And now the triumvirs had armies, fleets, spies, and an almost unlimited treasure to find them. There was no corner in the Mediterranean where they could hide. The amnesty had been a farce. Prescription was now the law. Gaius Trebonius, the man who cunningly had detained Marcus Antony outside the Achaemenid Senate while the others stabbed Caesar. He believed himself safe as governor of Asia. But a general loyal to Antony captured him, tortured him for days seeking information, and then beheaded him. His head was used as a ball by soldiers in the streets of Smyrna. He was one of the first to die. A brutal warning of the kind of mercy they could expect. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus. Decimus was one of Caesar's closest friends, one of his most brilliant generals. Caesar had named him in his will as second heir if Octavian did not accept. It was he who on the morning of the Ides convinced a hesitant Caesar to go to the Senate. An intimate and devastating betrayal. After Philippi, his legions in Gaul abandoned him. Suddenly, the powerful general was a man alone. He tried to cross the Alps disguised as a Gallic chief. He sought refuge with a local chieftain whom he had once called friend. But loyalty has a price, and Decimus Brutus's head was worth a fortune. The Gallic chief did not hesitate. He murdered him in his own house and sent the head as a gift to Marcus Antony. The friend who convinced Caesar to walk toward his death was betrayed by a friend for the promise of gold. One by one they fell. Lucius Cassius, brother of the principal conspirator, was murdered by Octavian's order after the battle. Publius Casca, the first man to plunge his dagger into Caesar, fled from Philippi like a ghost. Legend says he wandered the world, tormented by guilt, until he committed suicide in an unknown place. Or perhaps the sea claimed him in a storm. His death is a mystery. His body was never found, as if the earth itself refused to give him burial. The hunt lasted more than a decade. It demonstrated Octavian's relentless memory. The last of the main assassins to die was Cassius Parmensis, a poet and writer who had put his pen at the service of the Republic. After Philippi, his life was an odyssey of escapes. He joined the pirate Sextus Pompeius in Sicily. When Pompeius was defeated, he committed the most ironic act of all. He joined Marcus Antony, the assassin of Caesar and the avenger of Caesar, united against Caesar's son, but he chose the losing side for the last time. After Antony's final defeat at the Battle of Actium, more than 14 years after the assassination, Octavian's men finally found him in Athens. He was dragged and executed without ceremony. With his death, Octavian's list was finally almost complete. One by one, they fell in battles, in dark alleys, by their own hand, or by that of a traitor. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Most died violently, many with the same daggers they had used on the Ides of March, fulfilling a kind of poetic and terrible justice. But while revenge was being consummated, something else was happening. With each Republican senator who died, with each silenced opponent, the power of a single man grew until it became absolute. The assassins had stabbed Caesar to kill the idea of a king. In the vacuum they left, they had cultivated the birth of something much more powerful and lasting, an emperor. The final irony of their sacrifice had not yet been revealed in all its magnitude. When the last of the assassins was hunted down and executed, a strange silence took hold of the Roman world. For the first time in almost 20 years, there was no active civil war. The purge had ended, but the peace that Octavian had brought was the peace of a cemetery. An entire generation of the Roman aristocracy. The men who had directed the Senate and commanded the legions for centuries were dead, murdered in the proscriptions, fallen at Philippi, or purged in later wars. The pact of the triumvirs, forged in the blood of their enemies, could not last. With the world at their feet, the two last predators, Marcus Antony and Octavian, turned against each other. It was a war of propaganda before being a war of swords. Octavian from Rome painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman general enslaved by a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Egypt. Antony from Alexandria saw Octavian as a tyrannical usurper, a greedy child clinging to power. The final clash came at sea in the Battle of Actium. It was the last convulsion of the dying republic. Octavian's victory was total. Marcus Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where cornered and without escape they took their own lives. The general threw himself upon his sword. The queen, according to legend, let herself be bitten by an asp. With their deaths, the last challenge to Octavian's power vanished. Now he was alone, completely alone at the summit. His father's assassins dead. The old guard of the Senate dead. His rivals Lepidus exiled and Antony dead, he had avenged Caesar in a way that not even Julius Caesar himself could have imagined. He had absolute and indisputable power over an empire that extended from Spain to Syria. And here is where the final and most crushing irony of history is revealed. The liberators had stabbed Caesar because they feared he would crown himself king. They feared that a single man would destroy 500 years of republican tradition. Their act, designed to save the republic, was the catalyst that destroyed it completely. The wars they unleashed annihilated the political class that sustained it, leaving a power vacuum that only one man could fill. Octavian had learned his father's lesson. He did not declare himself dictator for life. He did not use a crown. He was much more intelligent. In the year 27 before Christ, he entered the Senate and in an act of political genius renounced all his extraordinary powers and declared the Republic restored. It was a brilliant farce. He maintained the appearances of the Republic, the consuls, the senators, the assemblies, but concentrated in his person legally and gradually all real powers. Control of the army, of finances, of the richest provinces. The Senate, grateful for peace, granted him a new name, Augustus the Venerable. He became the first emperor of Rome. He ruled with more absolute power than Caesar ever dreamed, and did so for more than 40 years. He died of old age in his bed, deified as a god. Brutus, Cassius, and the others had killed a man to stop a king. The result of their sacrifice was not freedom, but the creation of an emperor and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, they did not manage to save the Republic. They only ensured that all who believed in it died, leaving the path free for the new order. Their struggle for freedom was the stepping stone upon which Augustus built his throne. The 23 stab wounds on the Senate floor did not prevent tyranny. They only chose the tyrant.